For nearly 3 months, I had been telling everyone I was going home to Canada. My daughter Audrey knew. My old neighbor Owen knew. I had started pricing out flights on WestJet, checking departure dates, thinking about which suitcases I would ship ahead and which I would carry on. Then one Sunday afternoon, I sat down at my kitchen table here in Cebu with a legal pad and actually worked out what going home was going to cost me. Not just the airfare, everything after the airfare. A rental apartment, first and last month's rent plus damage deposit, furniture because I had sold almost everything before I left, a used car because you cannot live where I am from without one, car insurance in Ontario, which, if you have not priced it recently, is its own particular punishment, groceries, a phone plan, utilities, and private health coverage because I had been out of the province long enough that my OHIP had lapsed. I filled 2 pages. Somewhere in the middle of the second page, I stopped writing, because the number at the bottom was not what I had been expecting. And the problem was not the one-time startup cost, though that was alarming enough on its own. The problem was the monthly number, what it would cost every single month just to exist in the place I kept calling home. I could afford to buy the plane ticket back to Canada. I was not sure I could afford to actually live there. Those are 2 very different problems. And sitting there in that apartment with the ceiling fan turning and a motorcycle horn going off outside for no reason I could identify, I understood for the first time that I had not been thinking about both of them. I had only been thinking about one. My name does not matter here. What matters is the situation, because I do not think it is as unusual as people assume. I am in my mid-60s. I spent over 30 years in supply chain management, warehouse operations, inventory systems, nothing that anyone finds interesting when I describe it at a dinner party, but steady work with a decent pension attached to it. When I retired, I had my workplace pension, my CPP, and my OAS. Combined, a little under $2,300 a month. In the years when the mortgage was paid and I was living in a house I already owned, that had felt like enough. Then the house sold. I had already decided to downsize, and I moved into a rental, and that was when I began to feel the gap between what was coming in and what was going out. My rent was $1,400 a month for a 2-bedroom in Hamilton, not Toronto, Hamilton. Utilities on top. Car insurance that renewed every year with a polite letter explaining why I owed more than last time. Grocery runs that had quietly doubled over the course of about 4 years. I remember standing in the dairy aisle in front of a dozen eggs priced at $8.70. I checked the label twice. I was not struggling. That is the frustrating part of that particular situation. I could still pay everything. I just could not do anything else. I had spent 33 years working toward a retirement where I would stop counting every purchase. Instead, I was counting more carefully than I ever had at 45. I started watching videos about living overseas. Portugal, Mexico, Thailand, the Philippines. At first, it was entertainment. Something to watch on a slow evening when the news had become too grim to sit with. Then I started paying attention to the actual numbers being mentioned. Apartments in Cebu for the equivalent of $450, $500 Canadian dollars a month. A full meal out for $12 to $14, drinks included. No car required in most of the neighborhoods people were describing. I had a legal pad. I have always had a legal pad, and I ran the numbers. And the numbers said I could live in Cebu on my pension income without touching my savings at all, and still have money remaining at the end of every month. I had not had money remaining at the end of a month in 4 years. So I came over. I did not sell a family home. I was already renting. I finished my lease, gave away the furniture that was not worth keeping, put the few things that mattered into a small storage unit in Hamilton, and flew to Cebu with 2 large suitcases and enough in savings that I felt I had given myself a reasonable buffer against being wrong. I also told Audrey I would come back if it did not work. She was skeptical. Not cruel about it, just clear-eyed. She said, "Dad, you don't handle heat well." I told her people adjust. She said she hoped I was right. She had that tone she gets where she is not arguing, she is just making sure I have registered the things she is saying. For the first year and a half, I adjusted better than either of us expected. My apartment is in a mid-rise building, well maintained, with a small balcony that gets morning light. I pay the equivalent of roughly 480 Canadian a month. Groceries, a combination of the local market near my building and one of the larger supermarkets for the things I prefer, run me around 340, 360 a month. I go out for a meal 2 or 3 times a week. A proper lunch at the restaurant I like best is somewhere between 400 and 500 pesos, which works out to 11 or 13 Canadian dollars with a drink. My phone plan cost almost nothing compared to what I was paying at home. I do not own a car. I use ride-share apps or take a jeepney when I feel like the slower option. My total monthly expenses settled somewhere between $11 and $1,200 Canadian, depending on the month. For the first time in years, I had $600 or $700 left at the end of the month that I did not owe to anyone. $600 or $700 that I could save or spend on something I actually wanted, or simply allow to sit there making me feel less anxious than I had been. That part worked exactly the way the numbers had suggested it would. What I had not planned for was what happens after the novelty wears off. There is a phase in the first months of living somewhere new where everything holds your attention because it is unfamiliar. The market is interesting because you do not know it yet. The food is interesting because you are still discovering it. The streets are interesting because you have not memorized them. That engagement is real, but it is also borrowed. Borrowed against the familiarity you will eventually build, and once you have built it, the interest fades into ordinary life. And once it became ordinary life, I started noticing everything I missed. I missed the particular feeling of driving on roads I already knew without thinking, where every intersection was automatic, and I never had to concentrate on the route. I missed certain foods, not anything fancy, just specific combinations and brands that had been part of my routine for decades. I missed being able to understand every conversation around me without making any effort at all. And I missed Audrey. And I missed her boys, my grandsons, who were growing in ways that video calls do not fully capture. You can see a face on a screen. You cannot see how tall someone has gotten, how they move differently than they did 6 months ago, the specific way they have started saying certain words. The missing started small and became something larger. I started thinking about going back in a vague, someday sort of way. The someday became something more concrete. The concrete became a plan. And the plan became the thing I was telling people, that I was moving back to Canada. The problem hit me on that Sunday afternoon with the legal pad. I had been thinking about the feeling of going home, not the mechanics. The feeling was Tim Hortons on a familiar corner, Sunday dinners at Audrey's, watching the boys play in the backyard from her kitchen window, roads I knew. The mechanics were different. Rental apartments in Hamilton had moved significantly while I had been away. The unit I had left, $1,400 a month, 2 bedrooms, nothing remarkable, had an equivalent on the market now for $1,900 to $2,200 depending on the building. That was before utilities, which in Ontario in winter are not something you can round down. Before internet, before anything extra at all. First and last month's deposit, up front, roughly $4,000 to $4,400, gone before I carried in a single box. Car. I would need one. I had sold my 2016 Civic before I left, got $12,000 for it, thought at the time that was fair. I went online and looked at what a comparable vehicle cost now. Similar car, similar year, similar mileage. The listing started at $18,000 and went up from there. I refreshed the page because I thought I might have filtered wrong. I had not filtered wrong. Car insurance in Ontario, For a driver who had been absent from the province and whose continuous coverage history had effectively been interrupted, I ran an online estimate. The quote came back at $255 a month for a used 2016 Civic. Not a new car, not a luxury vehicle, a 12-year-old Civic. And then the health coverage problem. I had been out of Ontario long enough that my OHIP had lapsed. To reinstate provincial coverage, I would need to be back and resident in Ontario for a waiting period before full benefits applied again. 3 months of being in Canada without provincial health insurance or buying private temporary coverage during that window. For a man in his mid-60s, private health coverage is not an incidental expense. I had been fortunate enough to stay healthy here, but I was not going to stay 64 forever. I added everything up. The startup costs alone, deposit, car, furniture, to replace what had left my storage unit or depreciated past usefulness. We're going to run somewhere between $25,000 and $35,000 before I had lived a single month back in Canada. And then the monthly number: rent, car costs, insurance, groceries, utilities, phone, incidentals, the small things that are never small when you add them up. Somewhere between $3,200 and $3,800 a month, against an income of $2,300. The gap was $1,100 to $1,500 every month, coming out of savings. I sat there looking at that number for a long time. The fan on my desk was doing the thing it does, where it clicks faintly on one side of its rotation. Somebody down the hall was having a conversation I could hear but not understand. A dog somewhere nearby had been barking on and off for 20 minutes. And I thought, what have I done? That was the first time I felt genuinely trapped. Not trapped in the Philippines. I had the money to buy a ticket. What I did not have was a plan for rebuilding a Canadian life without watching my savings erode steadily to a point where they could no longer protect me. Those savings were not meant to be touched. That was my buffer, the money between my monthly income and whatever emergency eventually happened. A health situation. Something happening to Audrey. The kind of thing you cannot predict and cannot afford to be unprepared for. And I was now looking at a scenario where going home meant depleting a significant portion of that buffer immediately, and then losing more of it every month after that, indefinitely. I got angry, mostly at myself. I should have tracked Canadian prices more carefully while I was away. I should have maintained my OHIP coverage as long as the rules permitted. I should have thought through the return scenario as seriously as I had thought through the departure scenario. Then I started displacing that anger toward Canada, which I recognized as unfair but could not entirely stop myself from doing. The rent prices were genuinely obscene. Ontario car insurance had been a quiet scandal for 20 years and nobody had fixed it. Grocery prices had gotten out of control, and the explanations offered never quite seemed to match the scale of the increases. Every article I read about housing affordability in Ontario became more evidence that I could not go back. Every inflation report became another lock. I spent about 3 weeks in that state, wanting to leave and afraid to leave simultaneously, resenting the life I still had because I had already decided it was supposed to be over. Not enjoying any of it, not the mornings on the balcony, not the market, not the meals out, none of it, because I had mentally checked out before my body had followed. Then Audrey said something on a video call that I initially found irritating. She asked me whether I was unhappy living in Cebu, or whether I was unhappy because I had decided I was supposed to want to be somewhere else. I said those sounded like the same question. She said they were not. She said if I was genuinely miserable here, and money was the only thing keeping me, that was one situation, and maybe it was worth the financial hit to fix it. But if my life here was actually fine, and I had simply worked myself into believing I needed to leave, then spending $30,000 and running a monthly deficit might not solve the thing I was actually feeling. It might just create a new set of problems on top of it. I told her I would think about it. She said she hoped I would actually think about it, and not just argue with her internally for a week, and then call her back pretending I had. I did both. She knew I would. A few weeks later, I booked a trip back to Canada. Not to move, to visit. I told myself I was going to spend real time with Audrey and the boys, look at apartments in person rather than on a screen, get a sense of the actual car market, and figure out whether the numbers felt different once I was standing inside them, rather than reading them on a laptop. Numbers on a screen are abstract. They can feel either worse or better than reality. I needed to know what returning would actually feel like when it was real. I am not going to pretend I was calm about it. As the departure date approached, I got genuinely excited. There is a list I kept making in my head of things I was going to eat. A specific breakfast sandwich from the Tim Hortons near Audrey's house that I had always taken for granted until I had not had access to it for 2 years. Certain cheeses. I was excited about driving again, about understanding every conversation around me without any effort, about seeing the boys in a room where I could also see how tall they had gotten. The first few days at Audrey's house were wonderful. Her husband picked me up from the airport, and we stopped for dinner on the way back. The boys were loud in the way that small boys are loud when they are genuinely happy to see someone. I slept better than I had in months. The weather was familiar. The light through the windows in the morning was the particular Ontario winter morning light that I had not seen in 2 years and had apparently missed without knowing it. For about 4 days, I was completely convinced I was coming back to stay. Then normal life resumed. Audrey went back to work. Her husband had his schedule. The boys had school and hockey practice and all the things that fill a family's week. And suddenly I was a man in his mid-60s sitting in somebody else's house on a Wednesday morning with nowhere to be. That was not their fault. They had told me I was welcome to stay. But sitting there, I understood something more clearly than I had before. I did not want to stay in somebody else's house. I wanted my own place. I had retired to have my own life, not to fold myself into the margins of someone else's. So I started looking at apartments. The first one was a 15-minute drive from Audrey's. The photos had been flattering. In person it was smaller than the images suggested, and the neighborhood did not feel the way I needed it to feel. Something about the street, the proximity to a main road, the general sense of the block. The leasing agent walked me through the cost breakdown. First month, last month, damage deposit, parking, utility connection fees. I was doing arithmetic in my head while she was still talking. I thanked her, walked back to the rental car, and sat looking at the dashboard for a while. The second apartment was nicer. It was also $200 more per month, and deliberately vague about what utilities would add on top. The third was the most affordable. It was also on a street that would have made a car not optional, but necessary for every single errand. Which brought me back around to the car problem, which brought me back around to the insurance problem, which started the whole calculation over again. One afternoon I drove to a large grocery store near Audrey's neighborhood. A normal grocery store, not a specialty shop, not somewhere trying to be upscale, just a regular store where regular people buy regular things. I put a week's worth of food in the cart the way I always had: coffee, bread, eggs, fruit, a few things for dinner, the usual. I looked at the total at the register. I looked back into the cart. Nothing in there was extravagant. That was simply what those things cost now. And standing in that aisle, something settled that had not settled from reading articles on my phone in Cebu. The Canada I had been missing was a Canada from before I left, before prices moved, before things shifted in the particular ways that things shift when you are not watching them day by day. The Canada I was standing in had kept going while I had been away, the way places do, and the version I had been homesick for was partially a memory and partially an invention. The roads were still the same roads. I still knew every turning, but it did not feel like mine in the way I had expected it to. not foreign. Something harder to name, like being too familiar with something to be a visitor, but too long gone to quite be a resident, somewhere in between. The night before my flight back to Cebu, Audrey and I sat at her kitchen table after the boys were in bed. She asked how the apartment search had gone. I told her the truth, not well. She said I could live with them, not as a temporary arrangement. She meant it as a real offer. A room, a place at the table, help with the boys in the mornings. She said it sincerely, the way Audrey says things she means. I considered it for longer than I expected to. Then I looked around that kitchen. Her life was built in this room. Her husband's rhythms, the boys' schedules, the specific way this household ran. It was full and functional and complete. I would be fitting myself into the gaps of it. In Cebu, I had my own mornings. I made coffee before anyone else was awake. I decided when to eat and where and whether to go out or stay in. I had built, without entirely noticing, a routine, a barber whose shop I knew, a market vendor I bought produce from twice a week, 2 or 3 restaurants where my order was either remembered or guessed correctly. None of it was remarkable. That was precisely the point. It was ordinary in the specific way that only a life you have actually built is ordinary. I had nearly walked away from all of that because I was homesick for a version of Canada that had continued moving without me. I flew back to Cebu. When I stepped off the plane and felt the heat of the arrival's hall, I waited for the wave of regret I half expected. Instead, what arrived was quieter than that. More like relief, actually. Not excitement, not emotion, just the simple recognition of a place I knew. I knew where I was going. I knew what my apartment looked like. I knew what I was going to buy at the market the next morning. After weeks of looking at apartments, I could not quite make work, and cars that cost more than I remembered, and insurance quotes that made me want to sit down. That predictability felt like something I had been undervaluing for a long time. I made some adjustments after I got back. I stopped trying to save every peso. I had moved to Cebu specifically for breathing room, and then I had turned that breathing room into a new version of the same anxious accounting I had been doing in Hamilton before I left. I bought the reading chair I had been putting off for over a year. I upgraded my internet connection so the calls with Audrey were clearer and more reliable. Small things, but they were mine. I also got serious about scheduling visits. Before the trip, I had been treating a return to Canada as something that would happen when the timing conveniently lined up. That was too vague. Distance becomes heavier when there is nothing concrete on the calendar. Audrey and I started planning properly. Not every detail worked out months in advance, but enough that I knew roughly when I would next see the boys in person, next sit at that kitchen table, next have that breakfast sandwich. That helped more than I had expected. I want to be careful about what I am and am not saying here, because I think it is easy to misread a story like this one. I am not saying that everyone who is thinking about retiring abroad should do it. I am not saying the Philippines is a better country than Canada. I am not saying that money is the only thing that matters when you are deciding where to spend the years you worked your whole life to reach. If you are genuinely unhappy living overseas, if you miss your family in a way that no amount of affordable rent compensates for, if your health situation makes distance from Canadian healthcare genuinely dangerous, if you feel unsafe or isolated in a way that is not going to improve, then going home, even at significant cost, may well be the right decision. There are things more important than a lower cost of living. I am clear about that. But I also want to say something that took me longer to understand than it should have. Going back to Canada is not automatically the solution just because Canada is familiar. Familiar and right are not the same thing. The life I kept missing was a specific life, a specific apartment, a specific car, a specific version of a grocery bill, and most of that life had continued changing while I was absent from it. I could have returned. It would have cost more than I wanted to spend, and I would have been watching my savings decrease in a way that would have eventually recreated the exact financial anxiety that had pushed me toward this decision in the first place. But it was possible. I was not trapped. What was not possible was going back and finding the life I had been imagining when I was homesick. That version was assembled from memory. Memory does not update automatically. Once I understood that, the decision I had been treating as a crisis became something I could actually think about clearly. I was not trapped. I was choosing between two imperfect options. One was expensive and familiar, and put me close to Audrey and the boys. The other was affordable and distant, and had gradually become its own kind of ordinary. Neither one gave me everything. Both were real. Choosing from that starting point was different from panicking. It felt like something I was actually doing, rather than something that was being done to me. If you are thinking about retiring overseas, and I know there are Canadians who are thinking about it, because the numbers that pushed me toward this have not improved, there is one thing I would do differently. Before you calculate how much you will save by leaving, calculate what it would actually cost to come back. Not just the airfare, the deposit, the furniture, the car, the insurance that will not remember you were a clean record driver for 35 years, the health coverage gap, and this one matters more than people realize, because OHIP has rules about extended absences, and coming back without coverage as a man in his 60s is not a position you want to be in. The months of monthly expenses that will exceed your income while you reestablish yourself. Living here can shift your baseline enough that Canadian prices, when you face them again directly, feel like a different country from the one stored in your memory. That is not a reason to avoid going. It is something you need to know before you let the storage unit go and cancel the insurance. Keep your options open longer than feels necessary. Maintain your provincial health coverage as long as the rules allow. Think carefully before selling anything you cannot easily or cheaply replace. And book a return visit before you have been gone so long that your memory of the place diverges too far from the current reality. And then, if you do go, actually be where you are. I did not do that for a long stretch of time. I sat in a perfectly manageable apartment in a city where my basic needs were covered and my budget was under control, and I spent my evenings looking at rental listings in Hamilton and reading articles about Canadian grocery prices. I was in Cebu physically, and somewhere else entirely in my head. That is a waste of the very thing you moved abroad to get. This morning I was up before it was fully light. I made coffee and stood on the balcony for a while, watching the street below start to come alive. The usual early morning things. A delivery bike going by, the smell of something cooking from somewhere nearby, a school bell in the distance from a school I have never managed to actually locate, despite having lived within earshot of it for over 2 years. Later in the morning, I talked to Audrey. She had a work story she wanted to tell me, something about a meeting that had gone longer than it had any right to. The boys were in the background making noise in the particular way they make noise when they are not actually upset, just present and loud. Her husband called something from another room that made her laugh at something I missed the beginning of. Normal Tuesday. Nothing significant happened. I noticed that. I noticed it specifically because there was a long period when I would have been sitting on this same balcony thinking about somewhere else, counting absences instead of paying attention to what was actually in front of me. I still miss Canada. I expect I always will. And I am honest enough to say I do not know with certainty where I will be in 5 years. Health changes. Circumstances change. Something could shift that makes a different calculation make more sense, and if it does, I will deal with it then rather than now. But right now, this is where things make sense. And after everything I put myself through trying to reach that conclusion, right now is enough.